Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back to the DisInformation Chronicle. I'm here today with Quay. He is the CEO of Atossa Therapeutics. It's a company that's developing breast cancer treatments. This is actually the seventh company he's founded. He's founded 6 other startups before, 7 FDA-approved pharmaceuticals, 96 patents in 22 different fields of medicine. But I'm here today to talk about his newest book that's out. It's his second book. It's The Code as Witness, How the Covid Genome Reveals Its Lab Origins. Thanks so much for coming today, Steve.
It's great to be here, Paul.
So I want to talk a little bit about your background, because your background's a little odd. You come across like an academic because you've got several hundred peer-reviewed papers, and yet you're in the private sector. So explain to people, how did you end up a guy with way more publications than the average private sector guy, and you're not an academic? How'd you end up where you are today?
Well, that could be a long story, but I'll try to give you the short version of that. I targeted my life. Well, I had my first lab when I was 17. I got to college, got the keys to a lab within 2 weeks, and just fell in love with doing research because it was always what I wanted to do, even as an undergrad. And then went to med school, got a PhD in chemistry because I still wanted to be science focused. And then went to Boston. During the day, I was a doctor at the Mass General, and at night, I was a photochemist with Goldman Crane over at MIT. You could do that when you're in your 20s. And then began teaching at Stanford as a 30-year-old. Finally, get my first job as a young professor and tenure track professor in the medical school at Stanford, and realized that what I really liked to do was more the intersection with science, medicine, and unmet needs. So in the early days, there was a machine called the MRI imaging machine. It was making wonderful pictures. I had the idea that if we developed a contrast agent for it, you could actually make better pictures. You could make movies of blood moving through the body and things along those lines. And that's what I ended up doing. So I left Stanford and then was, joint position for a few years. But although I was at Stanford for a decade, that launched my career in biotech. And I like to be at the intersection of science and medicine and unmet needs and helping people. And the drugs I've developed have helped about 80 million people. So it's a good life, and I'm happy where I'm at.
So let's just jump right into it. Your book's about the code, how it reveals its lab origins. So just if I talk to the science writers at the New York Times, if I go to the editor-in-chief of Science Magazine, if I talk to the AAAS, this thing happened in a wet mark in December in Wuhan, China. How did this pandemic really start?
I felt the same way in January of 2020 and in February of 2020 and in March of 2020. And then I began to see things that looked like signals that were inconsistent with the market. I started following them, running them to ground, and finally have concluded beyond a reasonable doubt. And you can those language expressions actually have mathematical probabilities associated with them. It's either 95% or 99% probable that it came from a laboratory. And so that was the focus of the work I did in late 2020 that led to my assistance in the State Department with David Asher and others, some congressional testimony, and finally this book, where I want to be clear, the focus of the book is establishing that it came from a laboratory, and the laboratory is the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But more importantly, what do we need to do in our policy world to prevent the next pandemic, which could be much worse?
Right. That's why we need to understand how it started. Just like you need to understand, how did a fire start so you can prevent the next fire. This is obvious. This is understood in plane crashes also. But for some reason, when it comes to these viruses, you can't ask these questions. If you're talking about this today in 2026, because there was a cover-up. Without a doubt, there was a cover-up. So let's go. Who was involved in this cover-up to make us so that you're writing a book today explaining how it came from a lab, and this is considered putting together new information? Who was involved in covering this up, and what was motivating them?
Well, Paul, I want to be sure I stay in my lane, as it were, which is an examination of the virus and its origin and why it came from a laboratory. There are probably, and I'm very careful about trying to not get into the heads of other people that I don't know and put motives in place for them. So that's why I get a little cautious about talking about.
No, we don't need to talk about motives. We can talk about actions. We can talk about actions that things did. Yeah. We know now that there are people who misdirected us to point to the fact that this thing could have come from a market. We know those people are. Why would they do this? There has to be reasons for it.
Well, first, let's talk about the facts, which is that beginning in January 2020, and then especially into February, March, and April. So those are the key months where you were standing at a bifurcation path. You can go to the left, you can go to the right. To the left is a market origin, to the right is laboratory. And there were decisions made that went against the foundational data that was in place at the time to take the market path as opposed to the laboratory path. Clearly, there's also evidence that since 2012 or 2014, I don't know, exactly. There are publications coming out of the National Institute of Health, both by the director, Francis Collins, and by the director of NIAID, around the concept that gain-of-function research, which was the concept of taking viruses and in a laboratory setting, changing their properties to perhaps make them more dangerous or more infectious or more lethal, that research, although risky, was worth the risk. They actually published in the Washington Post saying even if a pandemic arose, the risk was worth it. That's a scientific question that should be debated. It wasn't debated at the time. It was stated as a fact. But I think that the people who had that assessment or that position in 2012, 2014, now fast forward to January, February 2020, were stuck with being in the continuity of what they'd said before, as opposed to just being a neutral arbiter scientist and saying, hey, there's a lot of evidence that this thing doesn't look like it came from nature, and let's go from there.
Right. And just so people understand, NIAID stands for the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases. The person who was running that was Tony Fauci. And the Washington Post essay he's discussing from 2012, that was Francis Collins, head of NIH, Tony Fauci, head of NIAID, and then Tony's deputy. I think the guy's name, I can't remember on his name right now, but he left NIH and went to go make vaccines, I believe, for Merck. So the whole infectious disease viruses, I begin to understand now, is all tied in with also creating vaccines. Why is it important for us to know how this pandemic started? Why does it really matter today, 6 years later?
Yep. So I think you touched on it earlier, and I think the best example of why post-action analyses are important is in aviation and the FAA. So when commercial aviation was just, coming into its own in 50s, 60s, 70s, there were a lot of crashes.
Right.
And what happened was a virtual circle of analyses, post-analyses, and then changes in design, changes in operation, changes in training around pilots and things, to the point where we now have virtually none of the biggest carriers have accidents. We see regional carriers, which probably have a slightly lower level. Anyway, so that's the model here. And to the extent that this came from the laboratory, and to the extent that it was a manipulated virus, which my book establishes well beyond a reasonable doubt, those actions that led to the last pandemic should be looked at carefully, because if we continue doing that, the next pandemic might not be a 1% virus like SARS-CoV-2 was, but something more lethal.
Right.
And one of my analyses was to say, how lethal does something have to be to break society? I considered society, the pillars, to be food, fuel, police and fire, and healthcare. Those are the four pillars. And how much do you have to break those in order for society to break down? It's about 10%. So if a 12%, 50% virus could take us back to the 1880s in terms of quality of life.
It's funny you bring up the FAA and studying crashes. It's funny. I was talking to a very well-known trial attorney who told me that they don't even have any cases involving plane crashes anymore. They're just gone. There aren't any. We've made it so safe for commercial flights now that even the lawyers can't make any money off of it anymore. So explain to people, what is a simple answer to explain how we know that this came from lab? How would you be able to, and not to someone, a technical scientist, but to someone like my mom, what's a simple explanation that we know that this thing came from a lab? Because I'll tell you, my way of explaining it is because I've seen all the emails and everything. And what I say is, there was a cover-up. It's very obvious there was a cover-up. What we don't know from the cover-up was, were they covering up the fact that they knew this thing came from a lab, or were they covering up the fact that they might be embarrassed by the fact that they were funding research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and they're worried about the political implications of that? But regardless of what was going on, we know that there's a cover-up. So, but what are the positive evidence to show that this thing came from a lab? Yeah,
and I think that's an important distinction here, because when I wrote the book and when I analyzed, and all the analysis in the book is independent of all of the actions of the operative people behind the scenes that have come out by FOIA requests and that sort of thing. So one of the important points that I want to make ahead of time before I go into the explanation of it is the concept that, because I get criticized, this is a point where I try to be criticized and that it doesn't work. But anyway, all of the evidence is circumstantial evidence, which means we don't have direct lab books. We don't have testimony from someone inside a lab saying, I did this on this date to this virus. But having said that, much more of half of the trials in the US, criminal trials in the US, involve convicting someone and taking away their liberty based on circumstantial evidence.
Right.
So it's the standard for a lot of the judicial activity in the Western world.
Yeah,
So
we've executed people over circumstantial evidence.
precisely, Paul. Precisely. Yeah, that's well put. So the circumstantial evidence involves a number of different tiers, and I tried to look at this in a tiered fashion. So the first question is, does it come from nature or a laboratory? The answer there is to look at where it occurred in Wuhan. Where are the nearest viruses in nature to the virus genetically that escaped? What are the distances? How could you close the distance? Because one of the clearest, simplest things is Wuhan is about 1,100 kilometers, or the distance from Washington, D.C. to the Everglades, from the place where the nearest viruses are, southern China and Laos, that are related to SARS-CoV-2. So as I say in an analogy, it's sort of like being in Washington, D.C. and having a virus that looks like it came from the Everglades, but oh my gosh, they're working on that virus over next door at Naiad, 2 blocks away.
Right.
That kind of proximity is one of the first things that say, hey, I need to look at this more
I
carefully.
just want to step in for 1 second too. And we know that they were collecting viruses from these areas. It's funny because there's been 2 studies that have come out, both published in Cell, that say the same thing. They say, aha, we found the virus and it's here. It's 800 miles away. It's 1,100 miles away. And each time those studies come out, Carl Zimmer, the New York Times writer, scoops them up, puts them in the New York Times. And each time he does that, I'm like, hey, here's a study published by the researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I believe it's in 2022. And they talk about collecting viruses from these areas for over 10 years. So this study doesn't tell us anything because they've been collecting viruses and bringing them back to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for at least a decade.
Yeah, there's some very particular nuances about a particular set of virus trips they were making down to Wuhan, which are important here. So you're exactly right. In 2013, 2014, there was a small event inside China, which the world didn't hear about, but basically 4 workers were sent into a cave in Wuhan province, about 1,000 kilometers from Wuhan. And they all got sick. And then a couple more were sent in. It ended up being 6 men who were in there collecting bat guano, which is used for, well, it used to be used to make gunpowder because it's
Right.
a high nitrogen containing material, but now used for research. And we have records that the Wuhan Institute of Virology and EcoHealth Alliance was funding collection in these areas. And 4 of the 6 died. And every serious virologist in China was sent down to the hospitals they were at to examine them. Samples were taken. It looked like a SARS virus. And the world was never told about this event, which in retrospect is very interesting because there have been no direct SARS viruses in bats. That's a reservoir. They're in bats. We understand that bat to human transmission event. This would have been it because they were collecting bat feces, and it was never announced to the world. And that kind of misshape where you have a new singular event that the healthcare community would love to hear about, kept as a secret, is again something that's very suspicious.
Right. The one other thing that I think is very interesting, explain to people what a molecular clock is, because this
Mhm.
is something that I studied this in evolution biology, and we use genetic difference to explain how when populations have separated. For instance, you can go and you can also use different things. You can use fossil record, but for things that are still extant, that are still living, you can look at molecular differences between 2 closely related groups and figure out from going back when they separated. What is a molecular clock, and what does a molecular clock tell us about when this virus first began circulating?
Yeah, that's a great lead in here. So imagine that you're trying to copy a 30-letter word, which is basically what the genome of SARS-CoV-2 is. And you copy it. When a person gets infected, they probably make 1 billion copies inside that person. They're going to make mistakes. Now they actually have a mistake correction system, but the long and the short of it is about every 2 weeks on average, 26 times per year, that's pretty close to every 2 weeks, a virus will go into a patient, get around, cause an infection. The person will win or lose based on their own immune system. But as they cough out and as they transmit that to another person, about every 2 weeks, there'll be a letter change. And that letter change is then passed along to the progeny of that. So using computer softwares, you can not easily, but you can get to what's called the time to the most recent common ancestor, and you can get the genome of that. That again is one of the things that differentiates the market story that's on here versus the laboratory story, which is the market requires that the virus escaped into humans in December because
Right.
that's when the cases are in place. So any evidence that shows that the virus was circulating before December is a bit of circumstantial evidence against the market and in favor of something else. Long and short of it, the molecular clock shows that the virus first went into its first human sometime between mid-July and mid-September. It's a big range. We apologize for that, but that's what the computers say. But nonetheless, that's a window of time much before the December market data that everyone is relying on to say it came from market. And so there's no, if it doesn't happen in this one particular market in December of 2019, there's no other evidence for any market anywhere.
Right. So what's also interesting is I interviewed a woman. She worked with a bunch of Chinese researchers early on in the pandemic, and what they used to date when the virus first started killing people was they used the records of crematorias in Wuhan.
Yeah.
And it was a really interesting study because they couldn't even get the preprint published. And it was funny because when they put it together, they had researchers in China who were scared to put their name on it. First off, because they didn't want to. At that time, people were disappearing, and so they put together a preprint. And the preprint then was first it was rejected, then they went to another site, and then it was ignored until January of 2023. Well, I called the woman up, and she explained to me what her study actually showed. Her study showed that when they looked to see what that they were able to back their model up, and they said, well, according to what we found, this thing was circulating in late September, maybe middle October, based upon the crematorias, the people that were dying in Wuhan. So both what they found, what the molecular clock shows, that this thing was circulating very early on. But here's something I thought was very interesting. Way before December, Matt Ridley, who's a British author, gave a talk at the NIH I think about 6 weeks ago. And he spoke about a State Department fact sheet that was released, I want to say in late 2020, maybe early 2021. And it pointed to 3 researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology who were sick with COVID-like illness. And this was in November. And a lot of people began pointing to that as, aha, this was the initial outbreak. Well, as soon as I saw that, because people were calling that patient 0, I knew it was wrong based upon the molecular clock. What I thought was interesting, though, was that no one at the NIH, when he gave this talk, caught that what he'd given was actually a factual error. And I think it's because their minds are so embedded in these studies that were published in Science magazine that say December, Wuhan market, that they're not even thinking about what the facts are anymore. When you bring a fact like that, they can't undermine it because they've never even addressed it. What is going on in the scientific community right now that they're not looking at the facts about how this pandemic started?
Yeah. So let me tease that apart because I think there are some aspects of a scientific mind analyzing a paper that can be part of that, and then there's probably the bias, as I would call it that. So one of the things that happened is if you're not truly looking at the foundational question of lab versus market, and you're just looking at a paper about the market, there's sort of a fence around that paper, and the paper stands on its own, and you're not bringing all other data, other evidence into your question on whether it came from the market or not. You're just analyzing a paper alone. You're absolutely right. And it was January of 2021 when the State Department, just before there was a transition from the President Trump's administration to President Biden's, they put out a fact sheet in January 2021 that identified 3 people who were likely sick with this. There's some speculation that one of the folks is a gentleman named Ben Hu. Who was at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and is really responsible for all of the reverse genetics, what I call gene jocks, of SARS-CoV-2, and he has a record of being the WIV's person in the seat to do manipulations, gain-of-function research. And so it would be quite natural if his background as a scientist working directly and making genetic changes in a virus could end up with a laboratory-acquired infection. They're called lab leaks. The official name is laboratory-acquired infection, so I'll tend to use that.
So we have these studies, though, published in Science that say they pretend the State Department fact sheet doesn't exist, right? That only the science published within a science journal is the only resources we can use. Anything else is discounted. I think Holden Thorpe tweeted out something along the lines of, they have a bad spy novel, we have science. But yet, we know from looking at a thing that I studied as an undergrad. It was an upper division course as an undergrad, evolutionary biology. You look at molecular clocks, and they want to deny that this even
Yeah.
exists. What do we do with the fact that Science Magazine has published studies that are completely false? That there's been criticism published in the peer-reviewed literature which they're ignoring. They pretended that also doesn't exist, and they're merely pushing a political objective and calling everyone else fact check wrong. What do we do with that when this has happened to science? This is a reality that we have to deal with. We can't pretend it
Yeah,
didn't
Paul,
happen.
it's a bigger issue, and I want to try to tease it apart because you've hit on something very, very important. So as you say, I have a record of having over 300 peer review publications, and I have in the past always appreciated the peer review process. You send it in, it goes to a desk, they distribute it to scientists who have expertise in your area, and they tear it apart. And it can be very embarrassing privately, but your paper comes out being a better product. I can tell you that everything about a lab origin or the design of SARS-CoV-2 that was sent through that process got what was called a desk rejection, which means it never got to a peer-reviewed scientist. It was rejected by the secretary sitting there basically saying, this paper is not even worthy of peer review.
Right.
That's a violation of the foundation of the process. And if that doesn't change, and it wasn't just me, I'm no longer an academic, so I could say my papers were not rejected by peer review because I'm not at Harvard or Stanford or something like that. But people who were at institutions who had evidence and studies, like the one at Ohio State, the woman who looked at the smoke content from satellite maps and
Right.
said, hey, these crematoriums, here's what they were, here's the death rate and the smoke in 2018, 2017. That's my ruler. I'm seeing 10 times as much smoke.
Right.
So I have 10,
Exactly.
those kind of things. They were desk rejected, which is a violation of the peer review process.
So I think it's funny you bring up peer review. I actually wrote a piece on this about how all the problems with peer review, and it kind of self-discloses what the problem is. It's the peers of the people that submitted the article. It's virologists judging their friends, other virologists. That's the problem. They're posting papers about their own field. It's like, did the cops commit police brutality? Well, let's go ask the cops. Well, they said no. So there you go. That's the answer. That's what we really have had for the last 6 years, is people self-judging themselves and not looking towards anyone outside the narrow field. And basically saying, well, we didn't do anything wrong because we looked and we judged ourselves, so we didn't do anything wrong.
Paul, if you look at history of science, and for example, the history of the physicists who led to all the equations and the analysis that then allowed technologists to create the atomic bomb, those same scientists were among the first to be in the public sphere saying, hey, we're responsible for this technology and we think it has some dangerous potential outcomes, and we'd like everyone to be, we need a public discourse about this. That's moral courage and that's moral fiber by those people. And it didn't happen to the virologists. And so to me, it's a moral failing. Again, I don't want to get in people's minds, but when you are not willing to do the right thing in the face of solid evidence, that's your moral compass not leading you in the right direction.
What I think is interesting is the guy who is, I think without a doubt, I think everyone agrees upon this, the cleverest man in creating these synthetic chimeric viruses is Ralph Baric. And HHS, well, what happened was I wrote a story about how NIH cut off all his grants, and University of North Carolina put him on leave. And then after I wrote that, then Science Magazine came along and rewrote my story, worked directly with him to rewrite the story. Now we know that HHS has debarred him. What do you think about what's happened with that whole process? Explain to people who Ralph Baric is. He really is. There are a lot, I call a lot of these people grifters. They're not really that great of scientists who are some of the most outspoken ones, but Ralph Baric really is a certified genius. This guy really understands how these viruses, and he did a lot of the pioneering work in this area of making these synthetic viruses.
Yeah. Let me, if you don't mind, I will digress. I'll give you a little history lesson here. So go back to the early 2000s. We have a gentleman named Dr. Michael Lei, who's a Taiwanese virologist at USC in California, who really is the grandfather of coronaviruses. So a coronavirus is defined by having a particular kind of RNA strand and then the genes in a particular order. That makes it a coronavirus. So he's the godfather of the entire class. His postdoc was a gentleman named Ralph Barrick, who grew up in North Carolina, had come out there to study coronaviruses under Michael. And when SARS-1 occurred, the Taiwanese government asked Michael to come back and head up Academic Asinica, which is the NIH of Taiwan, which he
And
did.
this SARS-1 is, we're talking 2003, right?
We are talking 2003, 2004.
Right.
It was a natural SARS. It was the first natural SARS-like virus that caused a human pandemic. About 8,000 people infected, about 1,000 died. So at that point in time, Ralph went back to his native North Carolina and began doing work there. And he took the coronavirus, which Michael's research was on collecting them from nature, testing them in the laboratory, characterizing them, kind of taxonomy, sort of Charles Darwin kind of taxonomy research, if you can imagine it. What Ralph did was bring the tools of biotechnology, gene mutations, changing genes, dropping genes in, moving them in and out, to bear in the coronavirus space. And you're absolutely right. He is a extremely skillful. He and his team, of course, it's always like 30
Right.
people. Their laboratory it has all the foundational research around what you can do with coronaviruses in the laboratory, how you can change their genome, how you can drop genes in and out, how you can actually make what's called a consensus genome. He solved one of the most interesting problems, but in a way that also obfuscates attribution to laboratories. So one of the challenges is you go out, you collect feces from bats, and you try to grow them in the lab, and 90% of the time they don't grow. And so what was happening was people were sequencing them and they still couldn't get them to grow. So he and a postdoc, graduate student named Donaldson came up with the idea, let's make a consensus genome. So let's use our computers to take 5 or 6 genomes that won't grow in a virus, put them together and make the consensus of them, because maybe we were making mistakes in our sequencing or something like that. And when they did that, they could grow them in a consistent fashion. What this also does, though, it creates a virus that has never existed in nature.
Right.
Because each of the positions is synthesized by a computer program that's averaging. So you can end up with, so if someone says, well, how far behind is this from the nature? You'd say, well, it might be 20, 30 years because it has a genetic clock, a molecular clock that looks like it went 20, 30 years back, where it's really just an average of a bunch of other viruses. So it both gives you something that could go in the laboratory, but it obfuscates the source by doing that.
Right. Yeah. What do you think we need to do to stop? They're first off, from the virology community, they're pretending that they've done nothing wrong. You can get on Blue Sky and see it. They're acting like they're under assault. How dare you accuse us of this? We didn't cause 20 million deaths and a complete crashing the economy. It wasn't us. You guys hate science. You're anti-science, on and on. What do we do to stop this from happening again? What steps do you think we need to take? Because right now we have an executive order from President Trump to stop dangerous gain of function. It's been sitting in the White House now it's well over, I don't know how many months it is overdue. What steps do you think we need to take?
Yeah. So what's happening at the administration level is, as you say, there was an executive order that was sent to the Office of Technology and Science Policy, OSTP, which is the group inside the White House that unifies a policy across all of the different branches of government. So they have to satisfy the DOD and the EPA and the NIH and all of that.
CIA, USDA, FDA. I was shocked how many people how many agencies are involved. I almost was concerned, like, who's not involved? That's what I was trying to figure out.
Well, Paul, if you flip it around, an organization like the OSTP is very useful because it takes, you have a unitary government with a president, and once he makes a proclamation in an executive order, then this group is designed to harmonize it across the breadth of the government.
Right.
Otherwise, you'd have each agency doing their own version of what President Trump had said, and then you get disparate outcomes. So it's a complex process, and they're a little bit behind on it. But the point is that I think cost benefit analysis around doing these kinds of experiments. What will be the societal benefit of the studies? What are the risks if a scientist gets infected with it and goes into their community? And rebalance that analysis. Because I think in almost all cases that I can imagine, and I'm pretty creative, the cost-benefit ratio falls on the cost side, and therefore you shouldn't do the experiments. Or there's a less lethal way of doing this. You don't have to work with live viruses. You can work with what's called pseudoviruses, which have, by mechanistic methods, have no ability to ever cause an outbreak in a human.
Well, yeah, I think obviously the cost benefit is not working. We had a lab set up in Wuhan to stop pandemics, and the pandemic started in that lab. This is the same as if the fire that burned down half the city started in the backyard of the fire department. I mean, what are we doing here? And then the firemen are all mad and say, well, why are you blaming us? We are protecting you guys. And this is what we're dealing with today. I want to bring up another issue. This is a broader issue than this pandemic, because I'm seeing Trump has come in and Secretary Kennedy has come in and said, look, infectious diseases, we're getting away from all this stuff. The biodefensive was going on at NIAID, for instance. And we're going to focus more on what's actually really harming people, which is chronic disease. If you go to the CDC website and you look up the top 10 killers of what's killing Americans, none of those top 10s is infectious diseases, okay? And yet, all we're hearing all the time in the media is infectious disease, infectious disease. Last year, it was wall-to-wall measles. Every time you turn around, there was another story about measles. I think 2 or 3 Americans died last year of measles, right? We've got 12,000 people die every week from cancer. And yet, if you were a Martian and you had never been to Earth and all you did was read the Post, Stat News, the New York Times, you would think that measles was killing everyone. And then along comes Hantavirus. And then it's wall-to-wall Hantavirus. And I look it up, and in the last decade, around 100 Americans have died of hantavirus. So why am I reading about hantavirus all the time? Now it's what's in the news now. Ebola, Ebola, Ebola. In all of recorded medical history, when the first Ebola case came up, which I believe was 50 years ago, we've had 15,000 people have died of Ebola. Now, it's a big deal in certain parts of Africa, but I don't know why I keep reading it every single day almost that I open up the New York Times. What is going on? Why are we being inundated? I have my ideas, but I want to ask you, why are we being inundated with this constant fear of viruses? What do you think is behind it?
Well, it's multifactorial, I think is the first answer is we have a history. Media has this phrase that they use a lot. If it bleeds, it leads, which is to the extent that for media, for newspapers, for some of those people, sensational stories are what is their stock in trade. And so hemorrhagic fevers and some of this, there are certainly catastrophic situations that can be, and then the PPEs with the suits, the spacesuits people, it makes good media pictures. You are absolutely right. If you actually try to be, again, academic, let's look at deaths by decade. So 0 to 10, 10 to 20, up through 80, and segregate what are the causes of death in each of those decades of life for Americans. It's only the first decade where infectious diseases get into the top 10. And then there's some interesting ways to mitigate it other than what's maybe being done. So I am not sure why we are at where we're at. NIAID came out and grew because of 2 events. One was the HIV crisis, which led to huge funding around HIV inside of NIAID from about 85 to about 2000. And then the towers and the anthrax and all of that came about, where there was the biodefense, bioweapons, all of that concepts in science was moved to NIAID or was put inside NIAID, as you say, around 2001 or 2002, and it grew there. So we're now at a place where the second largest institute in NIH, number 1 is National Cancer Institute, number 2 is NIAID in terms of dollars within a single institute, has a lot of money focused on, as you say, biodefense aspects and HIV research. We are at a point where we are very close with a 3-step process to putting HIV in the rearview mirror. It's implementation science, which is the kind that Director Bhattacharya is best at in terms, that one of his expertise is why is there disparities in healthcare delivery? And there's a science around delivery studies. That's the issue with HIV, because if you are infected, you can take a drug so you don't transmit it. If your partner is infected, you can take a drug so you don't get it from your partner. And if you are born to a mother that has HIV, you can there's a protocol within 72 hours of birth that will prevent the child from getting it. Those 3 steps would remove HIV in America. We're only at 50 to 60% implementation in many communities right now. If we got to 95 or above, we would see this gone by 2030.
Right. I want to give you my 2 ideas of what I think why we're seeing virus fear all the time. I think there's a subtext that's always kind of in the background, and sometimes it'll follow within the story. Sometimes it might follow in the second story. One is we pulled out of the WHO. This is all this pushing these viruses about pushing the WHO, pushing us back into membership for WHO. And the other one that you see it sometimes even in the same story, It's there right now with Ebola. Vaccines, 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 vaccines. What do you think about that? Because that's what I think is really pushing this. There's the forces pushing this constantly are people who want America to get back
Yeah.
in the WHO and pharma, which is one of the biggest funders of the media.
Yeah. So when it was first announced, it's a 1-year process to drop out of the WHO. So when it was first announced that President Trump wanted the United States to leave the WHO, I did an analysis of, again, the cost benefit and what we were getting from it and alternatives. And I concluded that bilateral agreements between the United States and countries on a specific level would be much more efficient and impactful for worldwide health than being inside the WHO. And that some of their policies where they were trying to put in transnational healthcare control were sort of against the sovereignty of nations and things. So I was I was supportive of pulling out of the WHO. And I think you might be right, or probably are right. If you looked at some of the announcements around the Hantavirus or the Ebola virus, you'll see the director of WHO saying, I'm on the scene where the passengers are coming off the boat, as a first sentence of why the camera is rolling there. And then in the next sentence, he says, we need more funding for WHO and we need to be united around these things to help make it better. So these things are used a bit as a pretext for conversations around policy, which I think everybody does, but it doesn't make it right. And then the other thing is, I think you are right. We ended up having, again, a political discussion around vaccines rather than a scientific, medical, healthcare, public health discussion around vaccines. And it's just remarkable to have people have sort of a litmus test. Are you anti-vax? And I feel like saying, do you understand how crazy that question is? Because it's like saying, are you anti-chemotherapy?
Are you
It's
are
like,
you
well,
are you anti-medical device? What does that mean?
to be very specific, we need to talk about individual vaccines, the
Right.
incidence of the disease, the trade-off of the side effects. These are really important, nuanced public health conversations that get truncated because everyone just says, which side of the fence are you on, anti-vax or not anti-vax? And that's just an inappropriate pretext for a conversation.
Well, the thing that I don't like is what the media does is they've definitely picked one side. Their whole side is, are you anti-vax? They don't look at when you see people that are promoting a definitely cheerleading vaccine policy. They want to pretend that side effects don't exist or that people should not even be concerned about side effects. I just find it just completely ridiculous. The latest one was Senator Johnson just released an internal FDA analysis of the COVID vaccines. And the conclusion of this FDA report was it said that they had identified new risks that should possibly be in new safety information. So that's what the FDA's own conclusions were of their own internal study. And what NBC came out is no definitive risks that kids died from the vaccines. That's not what the study concluded. You inverted what the conclusions were to push this ridiculous narrative. And I just don't get it. I just think I think it has been used as a cudgel I've seen it used as a cudgel to attack people. I was being asked about vaccines back in 2017. I'd never even written on anything about vaccines. What are you talking about? Like, if there's a vaccine, I just go get it. I don't even think about these things. I just find the whole discussion to be very bizarre and very not helpful at all in any way.
Yeah, it's not helpful.
Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave with people about what they should consider about what happened with this pandemic? Because I don't think this is going away. I'll tell you, I've been in a couple of films, and one film that I was in, I was talking to the director later, and she couldn't even get the film placed. And what I told her is that I felt that this whole thing is kind of like what happened with the Vietnam War, where I can remember throughout the 70s, there's just no one really wanted to talk about the war. And then along came this show that was this big hit called Magnum PI. And it had this really good-looking guy named Tom Selleck. He was a Vietnam War veteran, and all his other buddies were Vietnam War veterans. And I was 10 years old at the time in 1980, and I remember asking my mom, was there a war in Vietnam? Because I didn't know, because we didn't talk about it. I knew as a kid there was a World War I, a World War II, some weird thing that happened in Korea. I knew there was a civil war, but I felt like there was this time in America where we just didn't want to talk about the Vietnam War. It was a shameful incident. And I kind of feel that's what's going on with COVID, is no one wants to talk about it, but I think it's going to come back. It just can't. Not when something so terrible happened to so many people.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that analogy, if I could just give a little of my own history there, I think it's important. So I'm a little bit older than you, and so in college and thereafter, there were objections to the Vietnam War and protests, and people were quite agitated about it. Fast forward to my time at Stanford University, I was also a staff physician at the Palo Alto VA clinic. So for the decade that I was at Stanford, part of my time was spent, in seeing the veterans at the clinic there. And in the 80s, probably 70%, 80% were Vietnam veterans. And so I got to know them, I got to talk to them, and I began to see if you have a policy issue about whether you should be in Asia in a war, that's one thing. But you shouldn't take it out on the guys that were sent there as 17, 18-year-olds because their draft number came up and they'd go to jail if they didn't do it. And so the nuance of those discussions and the humanity of the relationship to these vets was important. And I see the same thing now. I think we need to focus on the humanity around what happened with COVID, because we lost 15 million people, but you could probably almost put a zero on that of people who were affected, either their
Right.
business or their family or their children. Children lost years of education in school. When you wear a mask and you don't know how to talk very well, you can't learn phonics. You
Right.
need to see the lips and tongue and that to as all of these secondary effects, which again, to his credit, Professor Bhattacharya at Stanford was looking at this before he became director of NIH. But I think now we need to continue the analysis of how we can learn from this, like the FAA, so that we can do things right in the future. Because that's the most important thing is what from the past teaches of the future. I was going to say Mark Twain, but if you forget the past, you'll repeat it.
Yeah, it's funny. I was in a cab a couple years ago, and I'm looking at the cab driver, and I know you. How do I? And I'm talking to him in Madrid. I'm here in Madrid, and we start talking. I realized he ran this very well-known bar in downtown Madrid. It was a bar that if people would come to Madrid, I would take them there. It was just this very cool. It was an Andalusian bar from the south part of Spain. You would see all these great characters coming in there,
Yeah.
diplomats. And he lost his bar because of the pandemic. Lost his bar, and now he's a cab driver. And I remember getting out of the cab, and I was so angry because I just didn't know how many other people lost their livelihoods. For me, it was easy. I work from home, but so many people were affected. And we talked just about how many people died, but people
Yeah.
lost businesses. All these kids they're never going to catch up to where they're ever going to be again. Kids that dropped out of school and never came back. I just think the whole thing was really terrible. Anyways, Stephen, I want to thank you so much for being on. Uh, tell us again the name of your book.
The Code as Witness. It's an encounter book. It's available on Amazon pre-order. The official launch is June 9th of this year.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming back. And if you can, please at the bottom, please subscribe. And I appreciate everyone keep coming back.